Here we go. 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to a special show this evening. The show itself is between shows. As you may know from my last show, I'm actually changing the name of the Transatlantic Pararadio Show to a new show which was starting in the autumn. But I wanted to do a special show tonight because it's covering the conference that myself and a couple of friends will be speaking at in the next couple of weeks. And I thought you might be interested to hear what we're going to be talking about. So I was having a long chat with my friend Richard again, who was with me last time, discussing the different speakers at the conference. I'm hoping to get some of the speakers at the conference to do little interviews with me during the conference itself and bring that as a future show. Obviously myself and Richard, we can definitely do that because of course we are both part of this show. So here tonight is a special. I'm calling it the Nameless Show because the conference is called the Nameless Art. So I hope you enjoy it. Again, it's just an hour of us discussing the background to the conference and what people are going to be talking about. So I hope you'll find it interesting and informative. So here we go. Here is the Nameless Show. Yes, so here we are again. I'm with my good friend Richard, and we're going to talk today about an upcoming conference at which we're both speaking all about traditional witchcraft, which is called the Nameless Art. The talk is, that is. But before we get into that, I want to just ask a question that someone asked me about our previous conversation about voodoo, about veves, the symbolism, the images that you often see, what they are, where they came from, how they came about, and what do you think of them, really?
Right, that's quite a complex part of the subject, actually. I mean, veves are the ritual diagrams of voodoo. Each spirit has a veve which is descriptive of the powers and nature of that particular loa. The veves are traced as part of a voodoo ceremony, as an integral part of actually calling the spirits down, and the veves are actually traced in a variety of substances, usually cornmeal, but they can also have various other things, coloured pigments and things added to them, which again are pertinent to the various spirits being called. And they are normally traced in a diagram coming away from the bottom of the peristyle, or potomian tower as it's known, which is the central post or pillar within voodoo temples around which the ceremony is performed. And the Hugun or Mambo, the priest or priestess, will trace these as part of the ritual, as I've said, and then offerings will be placed to the spirit round that, and the veves are designed to actually channel the energy of the loa from the metaphysical realm into the physical. As far as their origins are concerned, this is going to be a little bit speculative because some people have said, Karen McCarthy Brown, for instance, who's a voodoo scholar in America, she has made an argument for the voodoo veves being drawn from, like Maya Deren did, Aztec sand paintings and things like that, whereas there are other arguments which have been mentioned by others that they are perhaps derived from the ritual diagrams of the of Africa, particularly in Dahomey. But the only problem with that argument is that their diagrams are used to enclose a sacred space rather than to actually call down a spirit. And in those terms, the voodoo veves have some similarity, as certain other people I know, Jake Stratton-Kent, I think, has pointed out, they have similarities with the diagrams within the grimoire tradition, and sort of compares these also to diagrams within other, sort of African diaspora religions. And there is also an argument for them being derived from the sacred symbols of the secret societies in West Africa, such as the Congo, which has influenced Petro within voodoo. And also, it's possible that there is a Freemasonic influence as well, which has come along later, and that has also influenced Vevey. So I can't give a definitive answer on, unfortunately, their origins, but those are kind of the best sort of hypotheses, if you like, that I've got at the moment on those.
Sure. One thing I'd noticed was the similarity between some of them and the Icelandic staves as well. There's a definite surface appearance of similarity, which I thought was quite fascinating. But they are, I'm fairly sure, also from my own research, is partly derived again from the Grimoire edition of the demonic seals as well. There's a crossover there, definitely.
Yes, I'd say there definitely is a link there.
Absolutely. And that was really it. That was one question that came to me, because it's an thing people would see the images of these things drawn on the ground, etc., but buildings and places didn't really know what they were about. So yeah, thank you for covering that one. Well, our main conversation today, as I said before, is the fact that we are both speaking at a conference here in Essex, the first weekend of September, and as I said before, it's covering aspects of witchcraft, and we have some excellent speakers who are joining us for the day. As I say, the two of us are speaking. We also have a chap called Michael Clark, who is, by his own admission, a practicing cunning man who's actually performed a particular ritual called the Toad Ritual, which is something we can get onto a bit later on, because it's actually one of those areas that's become quite almost notorious, I think is one way of putting it, within sort of modern witchcraft. And we have a chap called Martin Duffy, who's written an excellent book on effigies, which we'll talk about a bit more later as well, which kind of comes into the whole realm of the poppets as well, which is something that you feature in traditional witchcraft as well as being an actual witchcraft element item. And probably a headline speaker, if you like, is a woman called Gemma Gary, who is an author who's written a number of books on traditional witchcraft, also the co-founder and co-owner of Troy Books, which is probably one of the best current publishers of traditional witchcraft books, in fact occult books all over, I think is probably the best way to put it. But of course, one of my co-speakers is sitting in front of me, so what exactly are you going to be talking about, Richard?
I'm going to try and give a little bit of an overview of the traditional folk magic of Essex and East Anglia, particularly Essex because it's where I was born and bred and grew up. And it fascinated me to find that there is some family connections on my mother's side to sort of folk magic practices which are related to Romany magic, going back into the 19th century. So I really want to sort of talk a little bit about the sort of the agricultural background, if you like, to folk magic, and there will, I'm sure, be some crossovers with Michael's talk that you've already mentioned, because he's going to be talking about cunning law as a way of life, and I really want to sort of try and emphasise the fact that witchcraft and folk magic were not viewed as something completely separate. And I also want to talk about the fact that they are also not something which is exclusively pagan as well, because a lot of modern, particularly Wiccans and certain other modern witches, do seem to have a problem with Christianity, whereas in the past it was very much a grey area. They, a lot of the cunning folk were church-going Christians to a degree, and performed their magic under the auspices of God rather than the devil. But I will also be talking about the devil, because he was obviously a figure that they needed to kind of keep sweet, if you like, within agricultural communities, because if the devil left you alone, it meant you would have a happy life and you would have successful crops and fertility and everything. So he was somebody that you also needed to kind of keep appeased, if you like. So it's mainly going to be it's going to be called well, tentatively at the moment, Between God and the Devil, which is going to give a history of all those aspects of folk magic within Essex.
I know one particular area that we've talked about a number of occasions, and indeed you visited one not that long ago, are those little areas of ground that are left, aren't they, for essentially the devil on farmland in order to protect the land. They're absolutely fascinating. I know we may have talked about this on radio previously, but certainly in our own conversation we talked before how a lot of those kind of disappeared during the Second World War because of the need for land and food and farming. But as you know, there is certainly one left, not a million miles away. Yes,
there's one which all the evidence points to that's what it was in the past. I can't prove it, but that is something I will be going into in my talk, and I probably will put some photographs up, some slides of that particular place, and talk a little bit about that, and and how that kind of fits into the whole aspects of keeping the devil on side, if you like. So he will leave the rest of the farm alone and allow you to have a successful crop and a happy life.
Absolutely. I think it highlights in many ways for me one of the big divisions between. I don't know if you agree with that. I think there's been almost three kinds of witchcraft here. Overall, we have the modern Wicca, we have modern traditional witchcraft, and we have, for want of a better phrase, real witchcraft, if you like, historic witchcraft. That this is much more of the proper historic stuff. There's real evidence of actually being used.
Although I hesitate to use the word witchcraft, because if I look back, for example, to my maternal great-grandmother, the practices she did were largely to do with healing and various other sort of magical practices for protection and things like that. And although I can't ask her face to face because I never knew her, I think she would have probably been appalled at the term witch.
No, absolutely so. Yes.
Despite the fact that she came from Romany stock. And I think there's too much emphasis, I think, on terms like witch and cunning folk as two sides of some kind of divide, which they weren't. And as I say, this is one of the things I want to try and address, is the fact that folk magic was purely a way of life, which was just something which was done, and it wasn't looked on as being Christian, anti-Christian, to do with God necessarily or the devil necessarily, but they were all part of the same framework.
I think one way of looking at it is the fact that today we have a very strict division between astrology and astronomy. But that has not always been the case, has it? Not that long ago, they were seen as the same thing. There was not a difference there. And I think perhaps you could say that about sort of witchcraft, cunningcraft, folk magic. It was all kind of amorphous. It's only now our modernised, get back to the term modern again, division between these things. But I think the one thing I was trying to get at is, particularly with Wicca, is seen as far more as a religion these days as well. With
yes, Wicca is a religion.
Yeah, deified system of gods and goddesses, etc. Whereas again, modern traditional witchcraft doesn't have that kind of definite aspect to it. It's much more of a practical form of craft.
It is, but then you come into areas like the Cochrane craft and things like this, which have also tried to look at, say, well, this is traditional witchcraft, but have also decided to introduce religious elements into it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whereas the basic folk magic practices, whereas that's where the name, the Nameless Art, comes from, which are the basis of both the cunning craft, operative witchcraft, and to a degree of influenced Wicca, are a separate thing. And although they have a reverence for one's ancestors and a reverence for the spirits of place, genus loci as they're known, that it's not a religion in the same way as Wicca is. I mean, yes, there are festivals during the year, but they weren't religious festivals in the same way that Wicca was. They were all to do with agriculture and to do with farming.
Again, I mean, to use another parallel like this with astronomy, you talk about rune magic, and the runes, most people these days talk of being 3 or 4 specific set of runes as being the only ones that existed. But again, that's modernised nonsense. There's so many different. I mean, one of the writers I particularly like, a German chap, Siegfried Kammer, outlined 22 different sets of runes that he discovered this in his researches in Central Europe, and they were real ones, not some of the invented ones. So yeah, our modern understanding of these divisions is very much a modern way of compartmentalising things, sticking them in pigeonholes.
It is, and it's really only came about since the 1950s when Gerald Gardner invented. And let's be honest about this. He did invent Wicca, albeit based on the work and principles of a number of other individuals and organisations and traditions. And then shortly after that, there was a backlash, which was inevitable, because Gardner decided to say that his craft was the genuine one, and he could trace it back to medieval times with an unbroken lineage. And a lot of the problem for me, and I know you know about this as well, Andy, is that a lot of modern traditional witchcraft traditions let themselves down by trying to establish some kind of unbroken lineage which just doesn't exist.
Absolutely, it's a funny thing. The evidence that such a thing, or the lack of evidence of it existing, show is a easy way of putting it, is pretty bountiful now. I mean, a lot of what was Gardner's background was the idea of using stuff that Margaret Murray had claimed about this witch cult across Europe, which she wrote about for the Folklore magazine, of course, and then her own books on the subject, but they largely discredited. I mean, I know we've covered this previously with another show, different thing, Kerry. But it's an important point that that's what we're trying to say. That's what our conference is about, the other kind of witchcraft in the quotation marks. So it's not anti-Wicca as such, but it's a very different approach.
Yes, yeah, I should say, I have a lot of good friends who are Wiccans, and so do you, Andy, I know, and, we have nothing against Wicca at all, but we do want to make sure people do understand the differences between Wicca and the witchcraft that we're talking about.
Absolutely. I know that's one of the things that Michael, who first mentioned, is going to be actually outlining quite clearly. That,
yes.
Again, it's not an anti-thing, but also I don't see why Wicca people have such a big problem, the fact that their faith really only began in the 50s. All religions have a founding point. Christianity is a very specific founding point and founding date, if you like, a founding person. Because it isn't any more than 2,000 years old if it exists at all, of course, but that's the idea. It's a 2,000-year-old religion. So why is that a problem if it's a religion from the 1950s? It doesn't everything has to have a starting point.
Exactly. I think the problem is that when a lot of other people around the time of Gardner came out and said that they had pre-existing covens to Gardner and things like this, and a lot of witches, both traditional and Wiccan, got very, very hooked up in this my lineage is older than your lineage sort of game, and trying to each push theirs back further and further and further, and unfortunately to me that actually detracts from the actual traditions themselves. That too much focus is put on a lineage which, to be honest, is erroneous in most of these occasions.
I'd say one of the things that I have at home, which I'm really quite pleased to have picked up for very little money at all, was the original folklore edition with Margaret's original essay in, which I picked up about £3 in a second-hand bookshop, which is really nice to have, along with the book that came out afterwards. But just going back to what I was saying before about Michael and his talk, as well as talking about the two forms, I'll get on to the idea of what I'd call the real stuff a bit later on, because that ties in more what I'm going to be talking about. But one thing I want us to talk about a little bit is the whole black toad business, the toad ritual.
Yes.
It's a fascinating topic it came a little bit more into the forefront a few years back when a very noted, and unfortunately left us quite young, occult writer Andrew Chumley wrote a book called The Grimoire of the Golden Toad, which is about this particular. And there's elements of it. There's other stuff there's in them as well. There's sort of Middle Eastern stuff in some of the poetry in the Golden Toad book as well. But it's absolutely fascinating topic, don't you think? This whole notion of it.
It is. Obviously, Andrew was probably one of the first modern writers to give a detailed description of the ritual, albeit based on his own interpretation. And based on his own way of doing things, which I should also perhaps add at this point that a lot of people that have practiced what they call traditional witchcraft, because the traditions are broken, that they have had to kind of add in their own parts where there are gaps in rituals and things like this. And obviously the proof is whether the actual ritual worked or not. And obviously we know that Andrew did complete the toad ritual. But this is obviously one thing, that does, have a history of antiquity, which Andrew himself also wrote about in The Leap Between, which was kind of like the accompanying volume of the historical side to the work that he did within Grimoire of the Golden Toad.
It's actually his master's, the Leap Between the book itself.
Maybe, yeah. I couldn't comment on that one, Andrew.
Which is absolutely definitely worth getting hold of. Fortunately, it's a lot easier to get hold of Grimoire of the Golden Toad. That was limited to 77 copies, and now goes for 4 figures, and I'm not joking there. But the Leap Between is available as a paperback for about £14, and it's well worth getting hold of if you want a real detailed examination of a specific aspect of traditional magic, rather than using the witchcraft term. Then it's worth getting hold of. It's but I mean, we both know a fair bit about it, but you seem to be better at talking about it. What does it do? What does the ritual achieve?
Well, just to briefly go over it, it involves actually the ritual sacrifice, if you like, of a toad, where it is pinned by a blackthorn spike or various other things. Usually, although I should say there are variations of the rite, but the main one within East Anglia, which I know Michael will also talk about on the day, involves burying the toad within an anthill. Sometimes they're smeared with honey and things like that to make it sort of attractive and sweet, and then after a certain period is gone, the bones are then disinterred and thrown, according to tradition, into flowing water, and one particular bone is supposed to buck against the current so it won't be carried away. And that is the talismanic bone, which is then taken by the toad witch as they're known, and that is supposedly gives power over animals and various other things. And there are also various other related rights. I mean, one which I'm going to talk about in my talk to do with rights to do with your familiar spirit or fetch within East Anglia has certain similarities to do with the toad rite, and it's all about getting a particular bone which is used for magical power, which is then used to either have power over the devil, power as a talisman, power over animals and things like this, because it's particularly associated with the horseman's word.
Yes, we come on to that.
Which is, and you know, sort of supposedly would give power over horses, which is another big subject, which I'm sure, you know, Michael may well talk about on the day, or also I'm sure somebody will mention.
It's in my book as well. So
yes, so we will cover. Yeah, so as you can see, hopefully we're getting you know, most aspects of traditional wicchcraft will be covered at this conference. I think. I don't think we're going to miss much out.
That's very much the idea, to give a good overview of various aspects of it. And I just want to come back on, perhaps, as I'm also sitting here, to talk about my particular talk. Mine is based around a book that I've written, which will be published, I was hoping before the conference, but various things have been slightly been delayed. Should be available by certainly the end of this year, if not early next year. Mine is a compendium of real examples of witchcraft, magic, charms, spells, incantations that I've managed to cull from a number of sources, predominantly books that came out during the Victorian era of folklorists who've gone around the country collecting folklore, tales and stories and mythology, but also genuine examples of actual spells and charms that they've copied down verbatim, that have been said to them, or if they've got from diaries or sort of home publications, one or two cases, which are actual examples of real witchcraft, real magic and counter magic against witchcraft. Now, there's a lot of counter magic in there that I've come across. It is specifically designed to combat perceived curses and ill omens from witches. So it obviously was a common concern. Now, I think we can say that some of these things are to do with unusual things like the weather doing odd things and crops failing, etc., and looking to blame somebody for natural phenomena, natural disasters. Also how to combat and fight against natural anomalies and natural disasters that have been hitherto blamed on people like witches. Now, of course, we're talking about the real archetypal witch of the old lady who lives at the end of the village no one really wants to talk to, who's ugly and smelly and has cats. In one or two cases, that's very specifically what they're talking about. But they are an interesting collection of, as I say, genuine examples. And my talk really is about those examples, the real things that I've uncovered through these books. I set a deadline of no newer than 1930. Now, there's a specific reason for that, partly to do with copyright issues, to be perfectly honest with you, but also because things changed around the early 30s. There was a lot of, again, similar to what we were talking about before about the changes of the use of the land during the Second World War, but in the 30s you saw a massive increase in communications. Post service became much better, it was much quicker. Railways were spreading everywhere, the roads were being built, so communication between different regions was much better. So nowhere was as isolated as it used to be. So a lot of these practices were starting to disappear because of communication, because of a larger worldview, if you like, a more kind of conventional, scientific almost worldview. And a lot of the people like the charming folk, the cunning folk who people would turn to for problem, particularly illness, that was a common feature I found in the books I looked at. Because they simply couldn't afford doctors, or there wasn't a doctor available. There was nobody else that was available that had any knowledge of healing of any kind. Now, again, from my research, some of these people did know proper herbal remedies that actually do work, that we know work. Others would use charms and spells, probably part in the hope that a kind of placebo effect would occur, that if you believe it was going to work, it might help you. But that was the only choice they had. Because, of course, there was no NHS, etc., which you have over here in the UK, because a lot of ones are Americans, they wouldn't have heard of that. Obamacare, shall we say. And that changed the need for these people, because that was a free at the point of access, so you no longer needed to pay for it in advance. So people who had the cunning skills of herbcraft and magic to aid illness were no longer needed. So they did kind of rather die away. The other major reason I think these people existed and were used for, because there was very little in the way of police force. There was little you could do about problems. If someone had caused you an issue, a difficulty, there wasn't often anyone you could turn to. There was a police service, of course, but it was often very small and undermanned in local rural communities. And obviously, if you wanted a quick revenge against someone who'd wronged you, you could accuse them of witchcraft or use magic against them, or get a cunning man or cunning woman to perform spells against them. And I found quite a few examples of that, where you've tried to cause a negative effect upon somebody because you feel they've wronged you or hurt you. A couple of interesting examples I came across was a very detailed use of magical squares, which is something that is more common in high magic, sort of ceremonial magic, that you wouldn't necessarily find someone in rural England would have any knowledge of, much less actually make use of. But it appears to be, and it's in my book and it will be in my talk, an attempt to get a particular family out of a village that obviously the family were very difficult and no one particularly liked them. And these two stones were found in a grave, and on one side there were large numbers of squares with a lot of numbers written in them, something like 8 by 8 the squares, and on the other side there were incantations and spells to get rid of these people. Now that's quite unusual to find something like that in an English sort of countryside. I think this was, the book itself was from the 1870s, I think it was, so it was obviously of quite an age itself. So how old the tablets were, I don't know. Obviously there was no way of dating those, but they certainly were at least 120, 130 years old themselves, and that was absolutely fascinating. Another example, which I was really surprised by, I need to give a bit of a background. People who know my show may know that I've already written a couple of books previously, and one of them is called Liber Coronzom, which is about a knock-in magic. I actually talked about this in great detail on one of the PA UK shows, the Paranormal UK shows last year, talking to Irene and Mark, who run the network that this show goes out on. And if you want to have a dig around, I'm sure you'll find that either on the Podbean page or the YouTube page that runs for Paranormal UK Radio, where I talk in great detail about John Dee and knock-in magic from the 1500s. And what was particularly interesting was I came across an example of almost like a homemade exorcism which could be done by a layperson, and it talks to the usual kind of thing that seems to have come probably from an exorcist book, of a Bible type book. You can get from the Catholic Church, the Book of Exorcism essentially exists, and you can actually get hold of it, and this seems to be based on that. But one name absolutely leapt out to me that was a real surprise to come across, which was to Prince Coronzom. Now the interesting thing is, it's a very obscure name that only occurs once in John Dee's records as being basically the demon of the abyss. It's the negative force which you have to overcome. He describes it as being the mighty Prince Coronzom. Now it's a very obscure reference that even if you are familiar with knock-in magic, you might not even know that. If you know knock-in from the broader sense, from the Golden Dawn magic, you might not know about Coronzom. If you're into Aleister Crowley, you may know of him, but then Crowley changed the spelling, which my original book goes into a lot of detail about. But I was absolutely blown away to find that name being mentioned in a rural English book talking about an exorcism. That really surprised me, and it's still, unfortunately, been no way of tracing the origins of it, as a lot of these spells you really can't find the origins for at all. But that was a real surprise to find that written in there. You say Prince Coronzom. It's usually spelled with a Z, but this was spelled with an S in the middle, Coronzom. Now, and Z is a very unusual letter. It's not very commonly used until fairly recently, and I do wonder if the transcriber, because I imagine it was written out from probably a Catholic book of exorcism, they got this name from somewhere, didn't even know what Z was, or just misspelt it. But I'd love to know how they found that name. It's only been published at that time on the one occasion, as we know, the True and Faithful Relation, published in 1659. That's the only time it's been published. Dee's own diaries, you couldn't access those, they were locked away at that time. So someone must have seen a copy of, or had a copy of True and Faithful Relation, which was itself an expensive and quite rare book at the time. So it's absolutely fascinating, and I can't think of any other way, unless some kind of astral magical way in which they actually encountered the Coronzom name. It just really surprised me. As I said, the correct spelling of the name is Corozom, M at the end. It appears in Casaubon's book, True and Faithful Relation, same spelling but with an N and a nose at the end. Now this version of it in the book I was looking at ends in an N, so it definitely seems to have been that he's seen, or she even possibly, has seen the True and Faithful Relation rather than Dee's own diary, which is very clearly ends in an M, letter M for mother. So I found that was actually fascinating. What do you think about that?
Yes, I mean, it is strange. I mean, as we know, a lot of folk magic is based on other texts. I mean, another one which I know you're familiar with, Andy, is Scott's Discovery of Witchcraft.
Absolutely.
Which, when the third edition, I think it originally came out in 1584, and by the time the third edition appeared in, I think it was about 1665.
Around that date, wasn't it?
It had a veritable grimoire of folk magic appended to it, which wasn't produced by Scott but added by a later contributor. And spells from that are widely found within folk magic sources, within, they've been found within charms that have been found and recorded within personal, sort of magical notebooks of the time. And it's clear that a lot of people, because obviously a lot of the country folk didn't read or had quite a limited education, they probably saw diagrams which were to be used for a specific purpose and just took those diagrams without taking the incantations that went with them. And certainly Scott was a source, as you've already pointed out. The Merrick Casaubon's True and Faithful was another source, and there were certainly many others. I mean, and that's been the way going through the years, even going up to, as I know in your lecture, Andy, you're going to show a picture of Cunning Murrell's book of Magic and Conjurations, which actually repeats a charm which he's clearly copied from Barrett's Magus, which came out in 1801. So
Absolutely.
we're going forward a few centuries to Scott and Casaubon here, but the same thing is happening.
Absolutely.
So it's clear that that a lot of these people didn't possess these books, but perhaps had access to them, sort of copied parts from them, or even nicked them, maybe. I don't know.
Quite possibly. Actually, funny enough, you mentioned that, it brings you back to, I just remembered, the Magical Square I was talking about previously, the book that I found it in actually said that it had come from Agrippa, Cornelius Agrippa. Now, interestingly, we know that some of the stuff in Francis Barrett's The Magus comes from Agrippa.
A lot of it does,
Yeah,
yes.
certainly true.
Yes.
But he made a mistake. There's an error in his transcription of one of the squares. And the book, the folklore book that I found, this actual use of it, made the same error. So although the book I have says it came from Agrippa, it's clearly been copied from Magus, for the Magus.
Yeah, no, that's an
Quite
interesting point,
fascinating,
Andy. And I mean, and I think a lot of people kind of fail to correctly note the source material for a lot of these things, because you can, as you found, and as I've also found with looking at Cunning Murrell's book, that you can actually trace the exact point of source, because sometimes these things have been transcribed incorrectly.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the more fascinating things. I mean, Scott's Discovery of Witchcraft is fascinating anyway, but the fact that extra material, no one knows to put it in there, do they? It's a bit of a mystery where it came from. It really is. I've got a 3-volume set by a chap whose name I must admit has escaped me at the moment that tries to explain it in more detail. But it's speculative to say the least, I think. And his 3-volume set publishes part of the original book. Then he publishes volume 2 is a reproduction of the additional material, and then he tries to trace some of it. But it's a little bit wild, some of the speculation of where he thinks it's come from, and he's got a very unusual name, which I must admit, because I can't remember what it is. But that was so that's basically what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to show some real examples of these curses and incantations, and real evidence of how they were being used. And as I say, just talking briefly about Cunning Murrell, he's a character who keeps reoccurring. He's almost like a ghost that's sort of haunting us, because of course we go back to the fact we've mentioned previously about George Pickingill has supposedly been this father of witchcraft. That
Yes, I will be mentioning Pickingill in my lecture, but I'm not going to devote too much time to him, I'm afraid.
So we have
I don't feel he
previously as
merits
well.
it against Murrell. Who does? So.
Yeah, so I think it's something that actually I've certainly covered on a previous show. I think that was with Kerry. I think it was with Kerry in quite a lot of detail. If you want to look back to the previous show under the old name, of course we're now under a new name. But one of the things I noticed there, again, was that there is a handwritten example of Cunning Murrell's own magical work, and it is a direct copy from a page from the Magus. So he clearly had access to that. We know he lived in London for a period of time and may well have either met Barrett himself or
It's possible.
acquired certainly a copy of his book, the Magus or Celestial Intelligenza. And I actually wonder if that book wasn't more widely available than perhaps we realise because of these examples. I say the stone tablets I'm talking about with the magical squares were in the Midlands, so it made its way up to at least in the Midlands, because that's where those stone tablets were discovered. So I do wonder, because we know Scott's book was burned by the king, so there was not many copies of that around. Casaubon, there wasn't many produced of Joint Painful Relation, so we don't know how many intelligences exist. Yeah, so the majors were produced in 1801, wasn't it?
Yeah, 1801 was the first edition, and it was reprinted in 1875.
Now, judging that some of the stuff I'm looking at, the books themselves were written in the late 1800s, it's quite possible that that did spread further than perhaps we realise. And that could be a source, at least, of some of it. Some of the spells and incantations are very much homegrown. They've been obviously invented, and some of them ones, particularly the ones from Scotland, it's very much in a strong Scottish dialect. And I've tried to retain as much as possible the original spelling and grammar, as long as it's still readable, of course. Because it's like, what is this actually saying?
Yes, I mean, interesting you mentioned Scotland. I mean, one of the other things I'll be talking about is that, as the folklorist George Ewart Evans, who wrote back in the 1950s, pointed out, there is a lot of examples of folk magic in northeast Scotland and East Anglia which bear close parallels, and there does seem to be links between the two.
That is the fascinating thing, and that comes back to the horseman's word again, because that's the thing we've seen examples with, both of us in our own researches, Scotland and East Anglia. And it is an interesting question as to how that's come about. It's been suggested that some of the workers came from Scotland, kind of progressed down to East Anglia and worked there, but why specifically East Anglia, we don't know. But that seems to be more prevalent than anywhere else. And my book actually goes into, because I came across a lot of examples of both the Horseman Words material and the Toadbone Ritual. So I've actually got separate sections in my book on those areas specifically, and the Abracadabra, which is a very famous incantation that, again, seems to have come more Middle Eastern, I think. It comes from that kind of, but it's something that's permeated over here, and he's found lots of examples of that being used. So I have a separate chapter on that as well. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. It's based around the book, which I was hoping would be out in time, but won't be, but will be out fairly soon afterwards. It's called The Wicked Shall Decay, and it's with Three Hands Press, which, if you're into this kind of stuff, you've probably heard of them before. Yes. And it should be out to say, hopefully, the end of the year, if not at the absolute latest, early next year. And we're just going to take a break for a moment, so we're going to pause there before we talk about our final two speakers.
Good evening, Agent 47. It has come to our attention, through the highest intelligence sources, that Irene Allen Block has published her novel, The Psychic Spy. Our sources tell us that The Psychic Spy is a riveting thriller about Eileen Evans, a beautiful young psychic who is recruited by British intelligence during the Cold War to participate in their top-secret remote viewing spy program. Eileen soon finds herself plunged deeper into the darkest heart of the intelligence community as she is ultimately trained as a spy and a psychic assassin. Nick Redfern says The Psychic Spy is filled with adventure, intrigue, and shadowy characters, and as Irene Allen Block shows, the mind is a mysterious and dangerous tool. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to immediately purchase a copy of The Psychic Spy by Irene Allen Block, available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Glanatai.com. This tape will self-destruct in 1 second.
Yeah, so as we were just talking about before, with the conference that we're both involved in coming up in the first weekend of September, just to give you a bit more detail, if you happen to be in the UK, in the Essex area, we're at a place called the Balmoral Centre in Westcliff, and it's on, I think it's the 2nd of September, so it's the first Saturday in September. Obviously this show goes out around the world, so unfortunately, obviously a lot of people aren't going to get to it. I am hoping to be able to bring at least some extracts or examples of the conference in a future show with the permission of the speakers, just to give you an idea of what we talked about. But obviously I can't say that's a definite. I mean, obviously the two of us, we don't mind doing that. So it may, if anything, it'll be just the two of us, but hopefully the rest of the speakers will be okay with having extracts of their talks being broadcast on air. But getting on to another one is Martin Duffy. Now he's talking mainly about a topic that we briefly touched on last time we were talking, which is what are called in the neck of the world that you were talking about, or erroneously called voodoo dolls, which of course are actually puppets, which is an old English custom of magic. Do you know a lot about that?
It's mainly making human-style effigies for various magical purposes. They can be to curse somebody, to heal somebody. They're made out of various different, sort of things. They can be sort of like cloth dolls and things like that. And some of them are actually made out of edible substances. I've known sort of them be made of bread and things like this. But it is a very, very old practice of magic, which sort of goes back very, very much into antiquity. I mean, I think the ancient Greeks used sort of dolls and things in this way, and also in various other regions of the world. In Africa, for example, you've got dolls that we spoke about briefly during the voodoo talk. So yeah, a fascinating area, which certainly Martin's book is the most monumental and comprehensive study I think that I've ever actually seen on the subject, so it should be good.
It actually is a huge tome, and Martin's been published by Three Hands Press, who are publishing my book as well, so mine's coming early next year. And I thought one of the best ways to really get a handle on what Martin's talking about is you read a little bit from the Three Hands Press website, which includes Martin's book, Effigy of Graven Image and Holy Doll. It is monumental, it's huge. It runs at around about 500 pages, and it is actually quite a large format as well, so it's a pretty huge tome. I think the best way is to actually read from Three Hands Press's website page a description of what Martin's book is about. So over to you, Richard.
Right, well, what it's talking about here is that from ancient times to the present, humanity has wielded a plenitude of formulae for the making and manipulation of magical images. In esoteric traditions where image magic is particularly deep-rooted, the most prevalent motive is the poppet, that doll through whose agency the witch gains influence over the enfigured victim. Though such effigies popularly exact their curses by point of thorn and pin, image magic includes far more than vengeful malefica, being a complex sorcerous art, also including healing, love, sexual power, fertility, protection and magical knowledge. In its highest form, the ensouled effigy serves as a holy icon. These divine images, lovingly carved by the priests of many faiths, make present the multitude of gods on earth, becoming the focus of that form of veneration known as idolatry.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I think it is a theme, as he's saying there, you see not just obviously in traditional witchcraft, but around the world. It's almost, I sometimes wonder if it kind of mirrors the whole notion of man being created by God, sort of modelling the form of man, if you like, into coming into being and breathing life into it. A bit like the Golem legend, of course.
Arguably, yes, and obviously, you know, Adam, the first man, being created out of clay by God. You know, so yes, I think there are, you know, sort of throwbacks to you know, antiquity there.
That's an interesting analogy, isn't it? That probably is. You probably hit on it exactly there. That's the whole idea where it comes from, that creation of the image made of clay, because again, often these things are made of clay rather than I mean, we've seen modern examples where they've actually used Action Man dolls and the Barbie dolls. We both attended a conference earlier this year over in Boscastle, Cornwall, which was actually about cursing, and it did talk about that. In fact, there was an exhibit in the Museum of Witchcraft at the time, which is where Boscastle is, which is in Boscastle, as they say, which actually included examples of ancient and modern forms of effigy magic like that, the use of pins in dolls, etc. There was quite a few examples, and some were modern examples of things like a Barbie doll that had been painted very grotesquely and stuck with pins and various other implements. So that's what Martin's going to be covering. It'll be quite interesting to hear more about the history behind these things. It's something that we've seen, as it was just saying, erroneously linked with voodoo, which, as you were saying in our previous show, has almost become part of it now, because it's kind of absorbed that notion, but very much on the outside. Just as a funny little sideline, I used to work in a shop in London that sold predominantly things like quality fountain pens, writing implements, etc., to business people, and we occasionally had the little sort of joke gifts as well that people like to buy. One of them was a voodoo doll, which is a little cloth doll that was made. It was a voodoo doll made by Voodoo Lou, which was quite hilarious. And it was just one of the things we sold. And one particular afternoon, we had a woman go a little bit crazy when she found this in the shop, saying that she was a Christian, that this is the devil's work. How dare you sell such things to this shop? We were saying it's a joke, you know. But no, she was very serious. No, this is witchcraft. This is black magic. You shouldn't be selling these things. And I thought, okay, fair enough. That's your belief system. You know, we don't necessarily adhere to it, but it does cause a reaction. I mean, we know obviously films have played a big part in that, but in the whole, almost in the human sort of psyche, this idea of sticking pins in dolls to inflict pain is something you often talk about almost as a kind of just almost like a joke when you're annoyed with someone and get a doll and stick pins in it. We kind of say those sorts of things, but obviously this is where it all comes from. Well, kind of a magical tradition.
I mean, obviously, sympathetic magic, as it's known, i.e., treating an image or something else which is then has an effect on the person it's intended to, obviously is you know, very, very ancient part of folk magic and witchcraft.
Absolutely.
You know, going even beyond, you know, the puppets and the dolls. So.
The other book Martin has out, again through Three Hands Press, which I'll just briefly mention, it's very fair. It's called the Devil's Raiments, which, in occult literature, the vestments of the magical art are poorly understood, principally because few save the body of initiates behold them. The robe, the mask, the mantle, the garter, and the veil constituting the exterior arraignment of the witch, which trace their pedigree to a number of magical sources, each containing a mystery of form and function. That's Sir Martin's first book, I think it was actually. I think that came out before the effigy book, which talks about the clothing, essentially, in magic.
Yes, not sky-clad as Wiccans would have you believe.
That's actually an important point, and the clothing does play an important part in magical work, and ritual magic particularly. And the fact that you see predominantly Wiccan groups talking about the so-called sky-clad all really comes back to the fact that good old Gerald Gardner was a big fan of nudity, or something like naturism, and getting his kit off whenever you could get the opportunity.
Yes, and I think that's where the whole idea of nudity within Wicca comes from. It was really Gardner's own penchant, shall we say, for naturism, which he displayed during the 1940s and the early 1950s in various sort of naturist groups, which he was a part of, which actually influenced the idea of nudity in Wicca.
I also think Alex Sanders was quite a big fan of that as well. He seemed to, I think maybe slightly more pervy reasons he was into a lot of
well,
stuff.
Yes, although I have to say, if you look at all the pictures of Alex Sanders, whereas all those around him, the pretty young ladies such as his wife Maxine at the time are all naked, Alex only used to allow himself to be photographed in a robe.
Yeah, so that's a little cheeky, really.
Yeah, for reasons of personal, I don't know.
I think he'd like the bit of the salacious nature, shall we say.
Yes.
I mean, there was early magazines on witchcraft that were not far short of pornography, effectively.
This is true, and if you look at a lot of the 1970s reprints of books on magic and witchcraft in the early 70s, they usually had a topless woman on the front of them in some kind of form. As you say, it was a very, very salacious sort of thing to do.
Absolutely, that was I think for younger people picking up magazines, having a good nose around, it was an excuse. And I'm not buying pornography, this is about witchcraft and magic.
Yes.
It certainly is. Well, that's Martin. As I say, I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say, his talk. And then, of course, we have, last but not least, Gemma Gary, which Richard is quite familiar with. You've known her probably longer than I have.
I don't know her well, but I was just very, very impressed. I think Gemma's going to be talking about the background to her first book, Cornish Witchcraft, A Book of Ways, which outlines her...
Traditional Witchcraft.
Traditional Witchcraft, A Book of Ways, which actually outlines her revitalisation, for want of a better word, of traditional Cornish folk practices, which are drawn from the likes of the records of people like Bottrell and Hunt, who wrote in the 19th century.
Oh, that was an interesting example there. That's taken from the book that she's going to be talking about. One of the other books she's now had converted, if you like, into an audiobook is her book, The Black Toad, which comes back to the toad stuff we were talking about previously. And I know there's more in it than just about toad magic. There is a little bit about that, but it's another collection of spells and charms from old Cornwall. So here's an example.
The Toad Blessing. Upon taking residence in a new property, there is a West Country ritual employing the toad to make the new occupation a fortunate one. A fine black, dark toad is to be carried to the front door of the property and solemnly brought through the house and out of the rear door. Here, in the garden of the property, the creature is set free to dwell, and care is given to seeing that its needs are met and comforts provided. The presence of the black toad will bestow blessings of good fortune upon the property and its inhabitants, as well as ensuring a fruitful garden. Blessing by grave dust. The Cornish practitioner will visit the churchyard under the cover of night, and there, at the arrival of midnight, they shall gather grave dust within a properly conjured circle, and with the aid of the familiar spirits. The dust must then be baked within an iron vessel over a fire, and at its cooling, be ground finely into a powder. This is then to be placed to keep within a covered bowl or a lidded box, and throughout all the operations of the substance's preparation, the virtues of blessing and fecundity are to be worked into it by will and by spirit. When called to the work of blessing, under a moon of increase, the practitioner may carry the vessel in a dextral circle about the item, creature, person or place to receive the influence, casting all the while pinches of the grave dust to impart blessings of fecundity, good fortune, strength, and growth. To obtain wisdom from the dead. Under the cover of night, the witch will make their way to the churchyard to find the grave of the one whose spirit they wish to interrogate for wisdom. There, at the arrival of midnight, the witch will walk 9 times around the grave, muttering all the while they make their circumambulations in conjuration for the spirit to arise and give unto them the wisdom they seek.
Yeah, so that was an extract from one of the other books that Circle of Spears have turned into audiobooks. Interestingly, I've met both Mark Norman, who runs Circle of Spears, and I actually interviewed him on another show. I won't talk about that. He's a very interesting guy. He's himself quite knowledgeable about folklore, and his wife has written a play called Witch, which goes into some of the aspects in terms of as a play, but goes into some of the experiences of people from the later medieval times of witchcraft and persecution of supposed witches, which is also quite fascinating. But we can't really leave it there with Gemma. Obviously, one of the things that she's probably well known for now, of course, is Troy Books, her own publishing company, which she runs along with a partner, Gemma, a second there, which produce very good quality books, and they've published a number of titles from different authors, all talking around about witchcraft predominantly, the traditional witchcraft, as you were saying before. One of those whose book had one book out with them, and another one's come out, which is a reprint of an early book he's written, and his second previously published book is also coming out. He's going to be at the conference, but he's going to be in the audience, so I won't point him out, but and a chap by the name of Nigel Pearson, who I've met, we both met, who had his own book launched about a year ago, which we really both enjoyed. He's kind of almost inspired us to do this particular conference, yes, to actually talk about witchcraft as well. He's had books out through Troy Books, and again, one of the main writers for Troy is Gemma herself, and another book has come out recently, just been published, which focuses more on the neighbouring county of Devon, which is has its own traditional or witchcraft and magic as well. None of the material that appears in that book has been published. Older books, like my own book that I've written, which covers some of the material that we've got a little bit of a crossover between the two of us, but fortunately not too much, which was a concern, I must admit, but that's not really an issue. So that's everyone who's speaking during the daytime. As well as that, we're going to have a couple of stalls. My friend Richard here, as you may remember previously, as I mentioned before, is a second-hand book dealer, and he's getting together a nice collection of witchcraft related material specifically to be sold on the day. We have another stall holder who is making traditional craft implements and objects, including like leather-bound notebooks, things along those lines, and animal skulls and things like that kind of stuff that you would see being used. She's got a stall there as well. I have to say, my own publisher of my previous 2 books is also going to be there as a guest, as someone who's listening in, not speaking or anything, but he'll have my books with him as well, my first 2 books, Liber Coronzum and the Rune book I wrote. So it should be an interesting day. So I say my talk will briefly mention about the fact that there is an example of the Coronzum name appearing in one of these folklore books, so hopefully he'll have copies of Coronzum with him so people can buy it, but no, my publisher, he may well forget, but that's another story. Anyway, that's the daytime. We have a little extra going on in the evening, which I think will be quite fascinating, which is a little extra. You don't usually get these kind of conferences. You usually sit there for a few hours listening to people talk, then you just go off your separate ways, but we're actually doing a bit of a field trip, if you like, a little recce of the local area, which I'm sure you can tell us more about.
Yes, for those, weather permitting, obviously, if it's chucking it down with rain, we might have to rethink things, but if it's a fine dry evening, for those who wish to stay around, I'm conducting a little trip up to Hadley, which is no more than about sort of 15-20 minutes drive from where we'll be at the Balmoral Centre, just to take them round some of the sites associated with James Cunning Murrell, the last of the great Essex cunning men, who I'll be talking about in my lecture, because I think it's important for people to actually see the sort of environment that these people worked in, and I'm sure the other speakers will agree with me in that it's very, very important to establish connections with the spirits of certain places, and the certain places that Murrell still inhabited in Hadley, although changed, are still recognisable. So I think I'm going to take people up to the church and show the approximate area where Murrell is buried in St James the Less churchyard in Hadley. Although unfortunately his grave is not actually marked with a headstone, so we think we know where he's actually buried. and then to show people the site of the cottage where he used to live, which unfortunately is now a car park, so it's not terribly glamorous, but at least there are other wooden white weatherboardy cottages in the area which are very, very similar to the one Murrell himself would have actually lived in.
Certainly.
And then finally taking people up to Hadley Castle, which is the ruins of the castle on the Downs at Hadley, where Murrell used to walk and have a lot of his nighttime jaunts, and also used to sit and watch the sky through his telescope, used to study the stars, and just do a little meditational ritual at each of these sites, just to try and, for those who are interested, to actually tune into Murrell's spirit, which is still can be felt in the area.
Definitely, yeah. It's one of those. He deserves a blue plaque somewhere. Not quite sure where, because his cottage is gone, but I think he has a blue plaque somewhere.
Yes, yeah, it would be nice. Yeah. Yes.
I mean, it's our own little way of trying to redress the balance. I know it's something that we've talked about a number of times, but it's something that's close to both myself and Richard's heart. This whole notion, Connie Murrell is the man who should be credited as being the father of witchcraft, if you like, as opposed to Pickingill, who probably didn't do anything other than posed near a large car and was very, very tall during his lifetime.
Yes.
And it's one of those things that it's a little bit of a bugbear that we'll keep hammering on until the powers that be really understand that there is an error that needs to be addressed here. So we do tend to talk about that quite a bit. Well, that's it, I think, for today. We've kind of talked about, as I say, our own talks, and we've mentioned, obviously, the other speakers at our conference. I'm hoping to get the permission, as I say, of the other speakers to at least use extracts of their talks to make another show which would cover how the day went, basically. Obviously, Rich and I don't really have a problem with that, so we may well manage to get a show out of that, or if nobody else agrees, you might not. So, but we'll certainly work on the idea. But I hope you've enjoyed today. As I say, if you can't make it, obviously, that's a shame. If you can make it, we'll look forward to seeing you there. But we thought we'd try and cover some of the elements of what we're talking about to give you a more of an overall picture about the other side of magic, if you like, the other side of traditional magic that isn't all about Wicca, which, as we both would agree, is probably a nice entry point into this world. It's a reasonable, safe entry point into this world of magic, but you can stay within it and build and work purely within the Wicca world if you want to. So obviously a lot of people do. It is now an established religion, there's no doubt about that. It is recognised as a religion. Or you can move into what you might define as more practical approaches, more down to earth, more kind of working with the land, working with the world around you, if you like, with more traditional forms of magic. And as I was saying back at the beginning, we do have, I think, three forms, which is the Wicca: the modern traditional, which is more based on real historic material, but it is synthesized, it is worked into a system of magic, which someone like Jim McGarry has done very successfully, to some degree, or some, which I mentioned briefly, Nigel Pearson, his books have done that as well, have created that. And there are other writers out there we could talk about, a chap called Lee Morgan, who's written a book called The Nameless Art as well. He's based actually in Australia, but he's got a real system of magic going there that's more traditional. And then, of course, we have more elusive writers, shall we say, people like Andrew Chumley, who unfortunately is not with us anymore, who combined elements of what appears to be a real traditional magical system with very much some of his own ideas, coming from things like stuff from Spare, also voodoo as well. All these things kind of mixed in to build a very powerful system of magic that's not necessarily just of the landscape, but nevertheless its roots are firmly rooted in traditional witchcraft, certainly. So it's a real mixing, boiling pot or melting pot of different ideas that are out there. They don't have to conform to one particular approach. You can effectively craft your own if you want to, find your own way of doing things, and that's what it's about, to keep it alive. Traditions are traditions, but they need to be kept alive and active, otherwise just become history and lost, which often is the case, unfortunately. So you want to keep these things moving forward. So hopefully we've covered some of those things today and inspired people to look a bit further afield, perhaps look into our own books we've mentioned briefly as well, otherwise just more generally.
Yeah, and if anybody wants to find the event, it's available under the title The Nameless Art on Facebook. There's a Facebook page for it, and tickets can be bought through Eventbrite, which I think there is also a link through the Facebook page.
There is indeed. Absolutely. Just so you know, you're looking for the right one. A Nameless Art with an E on the end, because that's the old way of spelling it. And essentially that was our idea. We were talking briefly before about not using the term witches and witchcraft, because it was the nameless art. It didn't have a particular name attached to it. So that's our topic today. Hope you enjoyed the show. I'm going to be taking a bit of a break for a couple of months. There won't be no show now until probably October will be the next one. Just want to tantalise you with the first show in the new format with the new title. But we were back to a longer show, hopefully with my colleague Ron back available. As I said last time, the problem Ron and I have is that he works mainly at the weekends doing conferences around America, and I work during the week, so weekends is my time free to do these sorts of things. So we've had a real problem getting together, finding time that we can both work. But Conference season begins to sort of wind down in October, so hopefully be more freely available. So Ron will be back fairly regularly with me. Also Kerry will be popping on occasion, and Richard Hill, me and I